Welcome to Shaping the NYC Skyline, the podcast that explores the stories behind the buildings that shape our city. I'm your host, David Shamshovich, and I'm here with my co-host,
Brenda Slukowski. Hey guys, how are you? David, Camila, welcome.
Hi guys, how are you?
Good. There's 3 of us now.
Whoa.
I know.
We are multiplying.
We are growing exponentially.
Yeah.
You know who we spoke to, David?
The man, the myth, a living legend in the development community.
Yeah.
Ken Fisher of Cozen O'Connor.
One of the most humble guys I've ever met.
Seriously humble, and he has absolutely no reason to be. He's got quite an accomplished career. He's at the intersection of real estate and politics. He's the go-to guy for developers and others in the industry to get things done politically. And he has a lot of background in public interest in government. He was in city council, hosted his own show.
Such an interesting role.
To me, he embodies why we put together this podcast. Ken is shaping the New York City skyline.
Yeah. One building at a time.
I think he may be doing like 10 buildings at a time, but even today there was something in the newspaper and he was later in the day going to address that for a client. And his name appears in The Real Deal, the Commercial Observer, and every other real estate publication.
He's so knowledgeable and is very much focused on his communication strategy in different roles, both as a lawyer and as a politician.
He has to think that way. He has to think as, well, what does the public want? What does the community want? And it's not dissimilar from what we discussed with David McCarty of Alloy. It's looking at what the community wants. Let's improve the community. They'll support us. We'll support them. And we didn't start out with that theme. We didn't start out with the theme of being a mensch, like David Marks mentioned. But to me, that seems like it's weaving in and out as and evolving as a theme of this podcast to break down. Like these are very successful people who are really good at what they do. And they all have this excellent approach where they keep others in mind. And I think to me, that's the most convincing is doing things for the community. You may be representing developers, but that doesn't mean you can't have the community at heart.
Breaking stereotypes, one podcast episode at a time.
Ken was nice enough to come down to our office to do the interview. We like to do these interviews in person. We don't want to do them on Zoom, not because we can't, but because that interpersonal connection, I don't feel like you get that. There's something to be said about physically being here. And Ken was all about that. And he was so gracious to spend a very long time walking us through his career and giving us his thoughts, particularly when he's in so much in demand. And he was very gracious and we were very appreciative of.
We got really lucky. It was a good get.
Yeah.
And you know what? I think our Skyliners are really going to enjoy the interview.
That's right, Skyliners. So if you do like the interview, which, I mean, if you don't,
email me and tell me why.
And also, you're probably listening to the wrong podcast. You're probably looking for Smart List with Jason Bateman.
Don't direct them to a different podcast.
It's a really good podcast. Has nothing to do with this industry.
Right. So you can listen to both of them.
That's right. And without further ado, Ken Fisher.
Woo. Hey, David.
Hi, Brenda. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you on this fine morning?
Yeah, it's a little hot, actually.
I know our conference room does get a little warm.
It's a very hot day, and it's a perfect day for our guest.
It's a perfect day.
Brenda has a thing where she wants to sing on every single episode of the podcast. And,
but we cut it every time.
We cut it every time because our viewers have called in.
They've requested me to stop.
Pleading is more accurate. This is a guest who really doesn't need an introduction if you're in the development community. He's somewhat of a rock star, actually. He hosted a show called Citywide for CUNY TV cable show. We'll talk to him about that. He interviewed a number of leading New Yorkers. He was also named in City and State New York's 2022 Brooklyn Power 100, which is the borough's most politically powerful figures. And he also received a Lifetime Achievement Award in 2020. And
he's just rolling in the accolades.
I mean, it's basically like he's a Boy Scout and he has all the merit badges that I probably want. I wanted to read something that your partner, Stuart Shorenstein, wrote in an article in connection with your Lifetime Achievement Award that says, Ken has dedicated his life to the law and public service, and his work will impact New York City's skyline and residents for generations to come.
You mean Ken has been shaping the New York City skyline?
He's been shaping the New York City skyline.
Wow.
He's been involved in politics in some shape or form since childhood, and we'll talk to him about that. And he's a real estate attorney, land use attorney, political figure.
He's a jack of all trades.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was on the city council for 11 years before he left because he was just termed out. And we're going to discuss and get into all those things. Everybody welcome Ken Fisher.
Woo!
Well, thanks very much. And thanks for the opportunity. I'm looking forward to this. I also get to dress down today because I'm going to a construction site afterwards. So we did the government relations for JP Morgan on their new headquarters building, and I get to tour it today. But I just think of myself as a simple lawyer from Brooklyn. I've been doing this for a long time. I know a little bit about a lot of things. I know a lot about a few things, but I know a little bit about a lot of things, and I'm happy to talk about them with you today.
The first thing I want to get into is I know that your father, Harold Fisher, chaired the MTA in the 70s, and that clearly had some inspiration on you. And I read an article that you've been campaigning, campaigned for Hugh Carey and John F. Kennedy. Those were your earliest memories, and you were handing out flyers as you were a kid. How involved were you in politics, and what things did you do as a young kid?
Our family story is the American dream come true. My grandparents were immigrants. My dad grew up on the Lower East Side. He was fortunate enough and smart enough to be able to become a lawyer. In those days, you only need 1 year of college. Otherwise, I'm not sure that they could have afforded it. Started his law practice during the Depression. I'm the youngest of 5 kids by quite a bit. My brothers and sisters grew up in a relatively poor household. By the time I came around, my dad had gotten involved in Democratic Party politics in Brooklyn as an election lawyer and had started to move up the ranks, including getting some positions first with the city council, then with the state legislature. He was counsel to the Speaker of the State Assembly. He had talked this war hero, Hugh Carey, into running for Congress in a Republican seat. My brothers and sisters used to babysit for the Carey kids. They lived on the other side of Grand Army Plaza. I came along, my dad was doing better. I had many of the opportunities that my brothers and sisters didn't. But 3 of them got graduate degrees, 2 lawyers, 1 a nuclear physicist. My other sister was a successful business person. So I come along, 7 years old. I'm handing out flyers, politicians coming and going in our household. So, it was just sort of what we talked about. None of us played golf. None of us played tennis. We didn't have a weekend home. So politics was it for us. And I started to get involved with campaigns myself as a young teen, then went away to college, did some stuff while I was away, came back, law school, same kind of thing, including I was on the founding board of NYPIRG, the New York Public Interest Research Group. But then in 74, when Carey was elected governor, I definitely knew I had a job when I got out. So I spent my last year in law school working in a civil rights clinic doing work for prisoners in the state prison system in the county jail. Get out of law school, I worked for the state of New York for a year at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA. And to some extent, things have come full circle because now I'm working on a lot of alternative energy stuff. I wish they had done what we were advocating back then. In those days, NYSERDA was kind of a backwater. They were responsible for managing a radioactive waste dump near Buffalo called West Valley. We still have it. Nobody can figure out what to do with the waste, and a couple of other things, and then doing some research work. After a year, they moved the agency to Albany. I was newly married, and my brother, who was my dad's partner, convinced me to join the family law firm in Montague Street in Brooklyn Heights.
What kind of law did they do?
Well, by that point, my dad was the MTA chairman. He was known as one of Governor Carey's closest advisors. He was close to Mayor Koch and Beam. We were counsel to the Brooklyn Democratic Party. And so we had a eclectic practice of, not necessarily the stuff that would cross the Brooklyn Bridge for a small family law firm. So we were representing developers. I did community relations for Steve Ross from Related when he first came to New York.
Wow.
We did litigation for Bear Stearns before they went out of business. I did Donald Trump's liquor licenses in the 80s. And then eventually I became counsel to the Brooklyn Democratic Party and, represented a lot of politicians, ballot access, helping elect judges and all the stuff that goes with that. Well, we represented.
So even when you were practicing law, you were kind of in the political space, campaign law kind of thing.
Yeah, election law, campaign law, but also the relationships between business and law and government. We weren't lobbyists per se, but we were kind of known as a go-to firm for people who had issues of different kinds. And we were also known as pretty good lawyers. That was one of the things that
I should hope so.
My dad was an exceptional lawyer. My brother Andy was a pretty good lawyer too. I turned out to be okay. But my dad was
Humble.
I think you did pretty well for yourself.
My dad was one of those guys that if he didn't know what the law was, he knew what it ought to be. And so if you asked him a question, he could give you a pretty good sense of what you were going to find out when you hit the books. And I'd like to think that I've reached the stage where I can do that some of the time as well.
Usually when I think that I know what the law ought to be, it's the exact opposite.
So go with that gut instinct and then just flip it.
Do the opposite. But if my instinct is to do the opposite, then the opposite is probably wrong.
That's fair too.
Yes, it's like George Costanza and Seinfeld. So you then transitioned into private practice.
My brother Andy really had to work hard to convince me to join the family firm. And I'll give you one example. So we represented this public employee Teamster union headed by a guy named Barry Feinstein. It was the fiscal crisis. He was a pretty pivotal figure in it. But to me, I had this cartoon image of what a Teamster leader looked like. I assumed there was a guy with a potbelly and a cigar in his hand. Barry turned out to be a very sophisticated advocate who moved thousands of people from poverty into the middle class by working for the for the housing authority and for school safety and other titles that they represented. And he taught me a lot about respecting workers. And more than that, him, my dad, some of the consultants that they work with taught me pretty much everything I know about negotiations. In fact, I joke sometimes that I was raised by wolves.
Political wolves.
Yeah, intelligent wolves.
But Barry's...
like Game of Thrones.
Yeah, Barry's objective was to help his workers. And that wasn't a side of what being a labor leader that was the way that was being portrayed in the media at the time.
Do you think that's changed today?
No, the cartoon version is locked in the people who only know about organized labor from the media. I think if you're a union member yourself, then you are in more direct communications. You have more of a sense of who's representing you. But the fact of the matter is that such a small fraction of the workforce is unionized these days that they're not present in the public consciousness the way that they were, 20 or 30 years ago.
So you worked at the firm for about 15 years. And there must have been something in there that you liked about it. Do you want to sort of go into and why you stayed for so long after being convinced for such a long time to even go there?
Well, first of all, I spent an awful lot of time with my dad, my mom, got married just around the time that I joined the firm. Harold was at the peak of his power, so I was carrying his briefcase into a lot of really interesting meetings and getting to see things, and also getting the opportunity that I don't think I would have had in a big firm like I'm in now. I was arguing cases in several different appellate divisions. I was trying cases, working on appeals to the Court of Appeals, but also just sort of thrown into the mix of being told to go over to the courthouse and, argue a motion or get ready for a hearing. It was pretty heady times, and a great perch for me to see how the city was going to get through this. It was a pretty difficult time. One of the things that became a factor in my life was that Howard Golden was the borough president of Brooklyn and the Democratic county leader. He had succeeded Meade Esposito, who was of my father's generation, and I became Howie's political lawyer and ran around with him quite a bit. And that's what eventually led to my going to the city council.
And so your dad was, you said, Lower East Side, right? Manhattan. How did that transition happen to Brooklyn?
When he started practicing, he opened up his office in the Lincoln Building on 42nd Street in a suite with a bunch of other young lawyers. And he said that he would go to the movies in the afternoon because he didn't want them to know that he didn't have any business.
I love that. That sounds like a great plan.
Well, yeah, except that one day he went to the movies and there were the other guys from the suite.
Well, you don't have anything to do either?
So
what movie are you seeing?
So he moved to Brooklyn and opened up an office on, I think first on Girolamo Street, and then the landlord moved him to Court Street, and then eventually when we went to Montague Street. The building where I practiced for most of my career is now converted to residential, and I'm working with the owner of that building on another residential conversion across the street. So I think I've come full circle in terms of the neighborhood. But in those days, politics was different. It wasn't as professionalized. People got patronage jobs as a way of rewarding them for service to the party. But, it also meant that we had a certain stature that gave us the ability to support the candidates that we wanted to, no matter what the party organization was saying.
How was running for city council?
Somebody else, a district leader, was supposed to be the heir apparent. He called me in the fall of 1990 and said that he had decided not to run. He had a young family. and that I should. So I kind of thought about it over a long weekend, talked to my wife, and the next thing I knew, I was a candidate in what turned out to be a special election with 8 other candidates in it.
Wow.
That was scheduled for the end of February of 1991.
It's a short amount of time.
Special elections are theoretically nonpartisan, so we had to create our own ballot line. No one ran as the Democrat or the Republican. Some of the candidates were very well supported and financed. And as it turned out, I won by a sufficient margin that I never had a serious...
Congratulations.
Yeah, I never had a serious primary or general election challenge after that.
That's impressive.
Because people thought that, as long as I could hold on to my base and do a good job, that was the other thing. I was pretty visible as a council member, and we did a pretty good job. I had a great staff, made a lot of impact. But also on the politics of it, the district is so diverse, it's really hard to upset more than one constituency on an issue, right? What the people in Brooklyn Heights cared about or Park Slope cared about was so remote from what the people in Williamsburg and Greenpoint cared about that they could have been in separate cities. And that gave me, some ability to pick my fights and what I wanted to concentrate on.
Did that continue throughout your tenure there?
Yeah, we built support throughout. And the issues were very different. I mean, Williamsburg, people don't realize it, but some of the census tracts in Williamsburg have greater poverty than they do in Appalachia. The number of families doubled up, tripled up in public housing because of the housing shortage, the racial tensions there. The environmental justice issues in Greenpoint and Williamsburg took a lot of attention. But they weren't the most demanding constituents. The most demanding constituents were the people in Brooklyn Heights and Park Slope who were used to people jumping when, they were asked to do something. And so we had to make sure that their interests were protected as well, but they tended to be more about things like bluestone repairs on the sidewalk and landmarks issues and general quality of life.
Does anything stand out to you in those 11 years that was your focus? I mean, clearly you must have done a lot during that time, but are there anything that you're particularly proud of during that period?
Yeah, I would say the answer to that is yes. And maybe not in any particular order, but in terms of impact on people. I came up with the idea for what became known as the Childhood Asthma Initiative because I realized that asthma was a huge problem across the city, a huge economic toll on the city. And any time that a kid had asthma and wound up in the emergency room, it meant she wasn't in school, her parents weren't at work, and that there had to be a different approach. So we came up with the idea. We were able to secure what started out as about $5 million of funding. Eventually, the program grew of helping families find a medical home, empowering people, using youth organizations to outreach to people to make them aware of the fact that this was a condition that was treatable but needed attention. And the upshot of that was that they reduced the hospitalizations for kids with asthma by 30%.
Wow.
After the program was
literally
instituted.
saving children.
Yeah, that was pretty important to me.
Is there a reason that was one of your causes?
We started to hear about it as we were going out organizing an environmental justice coalition around a proposed incinerator at the Brooklyn Navy Yard and some other issues. And we'd go to meetings and ask if anybody in the audience, had asthma or knew somebody that had asthma. And just hands kept going up all over the place. So we tried to figure out what was government doing about it. And the answer was, we were providing medicine, but it was always on a reactive basis.
Yeah, you want to prevent it versus just treat it once it happens.
Yeah. The second area where I got some, notoriety and was I took on the Fulton fish market as an issue, and particularly the influence of organized crime. Giuliani came into office, and he had been a big crime fighter, particularly with the market. So I sent word to his people that he didn't want me to be more against organized crime than he was. And the next thing we knew, I was the principal sponsor of the legislation that allowed them to start regulating who could do business at the market. I made Peter Vallone, Speaker of the City Council, be the number one sponsor. I was number two because I didn't want claims that this was anti-Italian in any way. Then Giuliani's people asked me if I would work with them on regulating the other markets, Hunts Point and so forth. And then we took on the private carding industry. I had actually been approached by Mark Green, who was the public advocate at the time, and he had some ideas on how to do it. The Giuliani people didn't like his ideas. They didn't like him. I brokered an arrangement where what he wanted was in the bill together with what Giuliani was in the bill. We got that passed. It led to the creation of what's now the Business Integrity Commission that regulates the private carding industry. And, the prices of having garbage picked up went down once the cartel controlled the industry was no longer, taxing the businesses that provided the services. And then I guess the last thing, closer to home in my district, but the tension between the Hasidic and Latino communities was very dangerous at that time. It was around the time of the Crown Heights riots, different ethnic tensions, but the atmosphere was pretty rough.
Why Latino? Wouldn't it be African Americans?
Not in Williamsburg. Crown Heights, primarily African American, Caribbean American, and the Chabad, Lubavitcher Hasidim. In Williamsburg, it was primarily the Satmar and other super Orthodox sects, but surrounded in what was then called Los Suros, the South Side, by primarily Puerto Rican and then later Dominican and Mexican populations. And they were competing for scarce resources, the housing shortage, social services. And unfortunately, there were some politicians at the time that thought that they could advance their interests by fanning the flames of hatred because it solidified their base. And that wasn't my approach, and I didn't think it was a zero-sum game. And I thought that if we
sounds kind of familiar, honestly.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing.
If we could bring them together around the common issue, then we could make progress in other things. And we found that in environmental justice. I mentioned before the district had a series of problems. We had an underground oil spill larger than the Valdez disaster. We had an asthma belt, a lead belt. We had 2 sewage treatment plants, an incinerator that was just closed, a new one that was being proposed. Basically, the largest collection of environmental insults that you could find pretty much anywhere in New York. And I know what you yeah, but you didn't really have a problem with radioactive waste. Well, actually...
You named everything else under the sun.
Actually, we did, because the city's only depository for low-level radioactive waste happens to be in South Williamsburg. And I was approached by a very charismatic Latino leader, Luis Garden Acosta, from a group called El Puente, and he was organizing against the renewal of this facility's permits, and he dared me to bring Rabbi David Niederman, who was the spokesman for the Hasidic community, the head of the United Jewish Organization of Williamsburg. He dared me to bring Niederman in to an organizing meeting. Well, El Puente headquarters was a former church. Rabbi Niederman needed permission from the Grand Rebbe even to set foot inside of it. When they marched arm in arm through the neighborhood, leading a coalition of Jews, Blacks, Latinos, artists, it was a huge, powerful political statement. And it changed the tone of how we were able to approach City Hall for services after that. There was one moment where, over the course of it, it almost fell apart. NYCHA was opening up some new public housing, the first in decades, called the Berry Street houses, and a group of Latino activists being pushed by some of these politicians went in and occupied the buildings before they were open. And basically to say that they wanted to keep the Jews from moving in. The police commander at the time sent for me and the other elected officials. My job was to go to the Grand Rebbe and get his assurance that the Hasidim would not go in and occupy the buildings illegally if they were vacated. Nydia Velasquez, the new congresswoman from the area, went door to door in the buildings to convince the squatters that they should get out peacefully and that their interests would be heard. The next night, I got a call asking me to come back because there were about 300 angry Latinos, some with baseball bats, facing off across the street from about 60 or 70 Hasidic men. And I found myself in the middle of that, together with the precinct commander and one of the community liaisons from the mayor's office. And basically, we went to them and told them to go home, that we couldn't solve the problems of the community if we had to be there worried about whether or not a fight was going to break out. And eventually, we got things calmed down. Everybody dissipated. I got an award from the police commissioner, the highest civilian award for bravery. My wife thought I should have gotten an award for stupidity.
Aren't they the same thing?
Either one would be well deserved.
And I read about that. I was going to ask you about that. I'm glad you talked, because I read about that, and I was like, you're essentially a crime fighter.
Yeah. Well, look, I didn't know any better. And you know, what my wife said is I treated my constituents as if they were my clients. And I told my staff that, you know, having a meeting wasn't solving a problem. Solving a problem was solving a problem. But, you know, as I think back on those years, they couldn't be more remote from New York City today. And in fact, you know, you all, I would guess that, you know, what you know about that era was watching the graffiti on the subway trains and the reruns of Welcome Back, Kotter.
I grew up in Coney Island, so I have my entire life. So I was more familiar, I think, with that than maybe Camila and Brenda.
I did not grow up here.
Camila's from Brazil, and Brenda's
and I'm youngster.
Yeah.
You know, so we're a very different city, and it didn't have to be that way. Look, I consider myself part of the government that was the turnaround years. The 1990s were the turnaround years in New York, and we did a lot of things that laid the groundwork for the recovery later. But, you know, my last couple of months in office was basically devoted to working with the Red Cross to support efforts at the World Trade Center after 9/11. That was just before I left the council. And we worked, you know, with the police department, we worked with the Red Cross. Everything else was of no importance in comparison to that. And I have to say that Mike Bloomberg gets a lot of credit for rallying the city and keeping the business community from fleeing. And then we were well positioned once we got past that to take advantage of the new economy, the digital economy, the creative economy. People wanted to be in New York. Young people wanted to be in New York. And that's what fueled the prosperity that, you know, we've benefited from the last 20 years, to the point now where, you know, the politics of housing and development, you all know better than most, is all about how to put the brakes on and not how to keep the momentum moving.
You had hosted Citywide, which is a TV cable show, for several years. How did you get into that? Why did you get into that? And how did you fit all that in while you were doing these other things?
Well, it was a remarkable coincidence. Council members have some influence over some of the discretionary money in the budget. And I was able to secure a pretty substantial grant for CUNY TV to build a new studio. And by a coincidence, they asked me then to host a TV show.
Oh, they asked you to do it.
And I was able to do that for 19 years. And one of the reasons I was able to do it for so long, it was a monthly show, was that my best friend since third grade is a documentary maker, and he produced the show for me. By the way, he happens to live in a building on the Upper West Side, a co-op. I think there might be somebody at this firm who lives in the same building.
I think his name is Alvin Shine. No, that's how they know him. Ken and I spoke about it briefly.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I've known Alvin socially long before I knew him as a lawyer.
Alvin loves the call out, so you don't have to be afraid to say his name.
So not only are you a lawyer and a politician, you're also a TV show host.
Yeah. Well, I don't do that anymore, but, and people said I had a face for radio, but
no, a
face for podcast.
I think it's the opposite. I think you look, first of all, you look great in the show. You look great now, but you did it for 19 years. Somebody didn't just hand it to you and you're like, you know what? I'll do 19 years of this. You obviously loved it.
Look, some of it was more lighthearted than others in some of the shows. We did a lot of topics. We could pick whatever themes we wanted. But I want to tell you something. You mentioned the 9/11 show was the first anniversary of 9/11. So not too many people were going to be watching our show, but we took it pretty seriously, and it weighed on us. I had 3 guests on. One was the city council member. She had just left, who lived in the financial district and had chemically induced asthma from the smoke. The second was Joe Potasnik, who prominent rabbi and fire department chaplain who knew many of the people who were killed on the FDNY that day. And the third was a police lieutenant that I had developed a relationship with, who was also known as a civil rights leader by the name of Eric Adams. And so the show itself was pretty powerful. But I want to tell you a story about Eric Adams that most people don't know. Right after 9/11, he called me and he told me that the Arab community on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, the border of my district, were terrified that they were going to be blamed for what had happened because of where the hijackers came from. And he asked me to go with him to a meeting of the Merchants Association to assure them that they were not going to be persecuted. They were not going to be singled out. They were not going to be randomly deported. And it was important to him that I was there because I'm Jewish, because I was an elected official. We did it quietly. We didn't get any publicity about it. And it was about 2 weeks later that Mayor Giuliani convened a similar meeting in Gracie Mansion to let leaders of the Arab community from around the city know that, basically they were not the ones that were to blame at this. It told me a lot about Eric's character and watched his career since then. And now he's the mayor and he does things in a somewhat unconventional way, but he does them out of sincerity.
So after you hosted this television show, where did life take you next?
I was term limited from the city council. I ran for Brooklyn Borough President. Marty Markowitz beat me fair and square. It's one of the reasons I'm humble. When you've been rejected by 2.5 million people, it kind of puts you, in your place.
Well, how did Marty do that? Because he's the only Brooklyn president that I remember seeing ever. Like you turn around, Marty Markowitz is there.
Well, that was basically it. I mean, he was a full-time campaigner, more a campaigner than a legislator, the concerts and things. But in fairness to Marty, what he understood was that the new Brooklyn wanted to be affirmed. They wanted to be told that they were clever for living in Brooklyn. I was still in the mode of the turnaround years and talking about the problems that Brooklyn had and how I would solve the problems. And he just went around and said, I love Brooklyn as much as you do. And he captured the moment more than I did. But, as it turned out, my plan B was better than most people's plan A. I didn't want to be a solo practitioner anymore. I didn't want to be in a small firm. I went with a corporate boutique called Phillips Nizer, well-regarded firm, about 60 lawyers. I knew somebody who was on the management committee there. They recruited me. I was actually supposed to be a healthcare and labor lawyer. But not long after I got there, people came to me and they said, they had a problem with a variance. They had a problem getting their city contract registered. They had a problem because the Department of Investigations was looking at them. And they thought that my familiarity with how government worked would be beneficial to them. And not surprisingly, the majority of that was real estate because the city was booming. And not surprisingly, an awful lot of that was my old council district, Greenpoint, Williamsburg, Dumbo, downtown Brooklyn.
The hottest of the hot during that time, right?
And the people who were there, that had those issues, they knew me and were willing to take a chance on me. So I did that for about, 3 or 4 years, got recruited by a bigger firm. 2009, it went under, a 106-year-old law firm. Don't go with a startup.
Well, 2009 was a tough time.
Yeah.
That's Wolf Block, right?
That was Wolf Block, hit by the liquidity crisis. And then fortunately, Wolf Block-based firm, the firm I'm at now, Cozen O'Connor, knew the folks at Wolf Block very well. They cherry-picked about 80 of the lawyers that they wanted to come in, including the whole New York office. And that's where I've been ever since. And, it's worked out for me. It's worked out for Cozen. We've grown considerably over those years.
There's a quote that I read that I thought was very interesting that you had, which is representing the developers is much more fun than representing landlords because you get to see the skyline change.
Shaping the New York City skyline. Do you get to shape?
This is Brenda's shtick. She likes to repeat the podcast.
The name of the podcast in the podcast.
But it's true. We get to do that. I get to do it. You get to do it. You walk around the city and you say that building might not have been there, might not have been as tall, might not have had the income mix that it has if it hadn't been for the work that you do. And quite frankly, a lot of lawyers don't get to do that.
So
that was just organic.
It really encompasses what this podcast is about. And the reason that we wanted to start in the first place is because Shaping the Skyline it takes more than one individual. It's a developer, it's the community, it's the government, it's the attorneys, it's the politicians. So many things need to come together. And that's why on this podcast, we bring in those people. And it's important, where do they come from? Because you were born into it, but you sort of shape yourself into this role, which I think is an interesting one. And I've seen articles where you also talk about how you can't really describe your practice, right? Sort of like an integration between real estate and politics, bringing the public and the private together to get to agree. How summarize your practice if you were put on the spot to do so, which you are?
Well, some people say that I represent what are arguably the best developers in the city and what are allegedly some of the worst landlords. My skill set, if I have any other than making complicated things sound simple, is figuring out how to align the public and private interests. And it's particularly the case in the land use work that we do, where you're trying to overcome local opposition and find ways to get communities to accept that there's going to be change in their neighborhoods. I once published a letter in the New York Times, and I said I had a dream that the mayor announced an agreement with the Almighty to build a stairway to heaven. And when they announced the location, half the people said it would lead to gentrification. The other half said it would bring in the riffraff. And everybody agreed it would be bad for traffic. And because no good deed goes unpunished, I got a letter from an irate woman that I had been disrespectful to the wheelchair ban in my choice of metaphor. But I also tell my developer clients that they would not want to live next to the stairway to heaven unless they were either guaranteed that they were going to be first in line or that they were going to have the hot dog concession. Because no matter how beneficial, what they were doing, how creative they thought they were being, how many opportunities they thought they were creating, it was going to be disruptive to the people who lived there. And figuring out how to reconcile those interests, was something where I could draw on my experience as an elected official.
You're very humble, but there is a talent in that. And I also read another article where you talked about how you bring the sides together, how you figure that out, and how you bring the public and private interests together to come to a resolution. And there's an immense talent. It's not an easy thing to do, particularly when there's a lot of self-dealing, where even if something's good for the public and the community, if it's disruptive in any way to those people are going to be against. And I think your analogy about the stairway to heaven is just as pertinent today as when you said it. And that transitions means some of the specific things that you've handled that I want to briefly touch upon that also came up with things that were good, but that the community rallied against depending on their beliefs. And so the first thing I want to talk about is the Gowanus rezoning. And I know that there was a lot of people that were against it, and you had represented to make sure that an injunction had not been issued to prevent that rezoning.
Yeah. So in reality, there wasn't more than a dozen and a half people who were opposed to it.
Oh, that's much more comforting. I was under the impression that there were tons of people.
They're probably very loud though, right?
No. In fact, we know that because, we monitored their press conferences and things, and they had bigger mouths than they had numbers. And we went out and really organized in the community. The developer group that I work with were very smart about how they did it. We had a great consulting team on it. And the upshot was that the community board overwhelmingly supported it. The local council member, Brad Lander, right, one of the most left-wing members of the council, did a brilliant job of representing the people in that area, including the public housing residents who weren't going to get anything directly out of the rezoning, and working with then Mayor de Blasio, his predecessor in the council, to come up with a community benefits agreement that was comprehensive and extraordinary. So we sailed through the community board. The borough president supported it. The city planning commission supported it. And ultimately, the city council overwhelmingly approved it. Yeah, now there was an effort along the way to derail it, middle of COVID. The issue was whether or not you could have virtual public hearings or whether there had to be an in-person opportunity. We were able to work with the city lawyers to get that settled. They had a hybrid hearing and things moved forward. Then after the rezoning was approved, there was another lawsuit from the same group, and it was summarily dismissed from the court. It's still on appeal, but their motion for an injunction was denied. And go to the Gowanus today, you can see the buildings coming out of the ground.
Yeah.
And, it's going to be transformative for that neighborhood. But if you go back and you look at what was agreed to, in addition to unprecedented funding for public housing, there was an agreement that all of the developers would work with a local group, the Gowanus Conservancy, to have a public open space waterfront that worked for everybody. We participated in the drafting of an agreement with a group called Arts Gowanus to provide below market studio space for artists from the neighborhood to try and keep the flavor of what the Gowanus was. And along the way, there was a lot of work in the negotiations, but basically everybody's interests were aligned. What the community wanted was good for the developers. What the developers wanted was good for the community. And all of it was good for the city at large.
So just about the appeal that's happening right now, if they do somehow, win in that appeal, what are the consequences there when Gowanus is basically, they're building, we have so many clients that are building, they're almost finished building sometimes.
Construction is already underway.
David, I stopped predicting what judges were going to do when I was 11 years old, but I'll tell you this, that if the court below gets reversed, I will come back here and stand on my head.
Wow.
Because I think the chances are pretty slim. And I think the chances are pretty slim for two reasons. First of all, the actual issue on appeal is whether or not the court should overlook a failure to serve the city with the papers in a timely manner.
Yeah.
It's it's a procedural thing.
Yeah, a procedural thing. And you got to show some merits. But the fact of the matter is that in terms of challenging the environmental review part of a zoning change, since 2002, there have been 17 appellate decisions in the first and second department, and the city has won every one of them, including most recently the Elizabeth Garden case. That was the first department where I represent the developer in that. The city did most of the work, but where the city knows how to follow the procedures for the environmental review, and it's really the only way that people can try and challenge it, and it's sometimes successful at the lower court level, but not successful at the higher court level.
That's actually a great transition because the Elizabeth Street Garden development is really where I was going next. Another high profile item. And sort of the focus in my mind is the delay that this caused, right? And then how much you were trying to get and the developer and all those in support were trying to get this affordable senior housing built.
The Elizabeth Garden is a PR creation. The city was renting the space to a guy, since deceased, who owned a gallery next door. He was using it to store and sell his outdoor sculpture items. And it was only when he found out that they were getting ready to take it back to use it for affordable housing that he let the public in and sort of portrayed it as a public garden. It was never a public garden. It was always under the control of a commercial enterprise. So there were people who just wanted the open space. I was sympathetic to that. There were others who said that was their motivation. What they really didn't want was poor people in the neighborhood, particularly, LGBT homeless seniors who were the target audience for this. And I don't think the outcome was ever seriously in doubt. But what was just beyond fathom was that the judge that caught the case took a year to schedule argument, said that was because of COVID, and then almost 2 years to issue a decision. And this was reported at the time, but she only issued the decision after I went to the administrative judge and said that if we didn't get some justice in the case, that we were going to have to take it to the judicial disciplinary authorities. So she issued the decision. She ruled for the city on everything except the open space analysis. That appeal just got heard in June. And 3 weeks later, the Appellate Division First Department reversed her, and the entire case was dismissed. I think that most New York developers are sophisticated to understand that there's a litigation risk. The lenders understand that. They may not understand all of nuances of it. I also think if you're going through a zoning change, you have a pretty clear sense from the inception as to where the opposition is going to come from, what their points are going to be. And if you can't accommodate their interests during the approval process, you can protect record. You can make sure that you've covered all of your bases, that the city has covered all of their bases, so that when it does go to court, it can be disposed of on a record.
You had quoted something about it's important to get your communication strategy in order. How do you go about doing that in the complicated situations and the very tense situations that you find yourself involved in?
So first of all, talk to everybody, even the people that hate your guts. That's important not only because you may learn something, but also because third-party validators, editorial boards, elected officials, want to know that you're trying to be reasonable and responsive, and be responsive if you can. Second is not to be bashful about putting forward what you think the benefits of a project are, and at least in my case, not to be bashful about calling out the opposition for what they actually are. And then the hardest part, I think, is that the people who are going to be upset by development in the area, they know who they are. Right? They're told something is coming and they don't want it. The people who are going to benefit from it, they don't know who they are. right? The affordable housing tenants that, get the apartments that you all work on, they certainly have no idea that opportunity is going to come. If you consider being in a lottery with 10,000 other people an opportunity, but basically there's no mechanism for reaching out to people and saying they're going to get some benefit. So in some of the cases, what we've done is we've gone to community groups and others, and the developers said to them, we'll help you apply. We'll help you with credit counseling. We'll help you figure out how to file the applications. We'll try and give you a shot at these apartments. And by the way, if the projects are big enough, there are other things that we can do. We can put a school in, we can put an employment program in. Now you're able to put a face on what somebody who lives in that community can see as a reason to support something and not just to oppose it. It takes a lot of hard work. It takes an enlightened developer. But I can tell you that with Hallett's Point, the first phase where we worked for a couple of years with the Astoria Houses Tenants Association, and they supported us. I can tell you that on the Domino refinery complex on the Brooklyn waterfront, that Two Trees did, and more recently the Rivering project, we did the same thing. And where you have developers who are willing to put in the time and the effort and the money and to be thoughtful about it, it makes it a lot easier for folks like me to be able to help deliver that message.
Yeah. I mean, it all goes back to trying to benefit those people that are opposing it so that they see a reason not to oppose it, but to potentially support it.
Yeah. And also not let them get away with exaggerations or false claims.
I wanted to play a clip for you because I thought it was interesting. And this is you talking to someone from The Real Deal. And I just want to, maybe it'll pick up the audio. Hopefully, let's see.
But I'm particularly concerned about the Signature Bank portfolio, multifamily, underwritten on the expectation that rents were going to go up, low interest rates. It's all coming due in the next 3 to 5 years. Community Bank didn't buy that portfolio. And I'm concerned that a lot of those buildings are going to wind up in special services or in the hands of the wrong people who are not going to invest in them. And all of a sudden, we're going to have pockets of blight the way we did in the 90s. We got past that, but I'm really worried about it. I don't know what the solution is.
So aside from the comedic effect that they basically drowned you out at one of the most important parts, I think, that I was listening to, you were making a very good, interesting point. I actually don't know what the date of this is. I'm not sure.
It was a couple of months ago.
Was it?
That was recent.
Yeah, it was fairly recent. And the problems that you described there in terms of the defaults that could be coming up and the potential disaster that I've been hearing about is very pertinent.
The immediate problem is that there's a lot of debt on multifamily in New York that's coming due. And you had, multifamily for generations was, it was like having a coupon, right? You collected the rent, you fixed the building, and every 10, 20 years you refinanced, took some money out tax-free. That's how the great real estate families in New York made their money. We then went into a period, with the Wall Street money where people were effectively day trading apartment buildings and, to see if they could flip it, get units out of regulation, huge backlash. But it was coincident with a period of low interest rates and where banks were underwriting based on expectations and hopes and not necessarily what the actual rent rolls were. So I had banked with Signature Bank since they opened. And I can tell you that my wife and I had a sleepless night worrying if our cash card was going to work the next day or our savings were going to disappear. Fortunately, the Fed stepped in and took care of that. But they have $8 billion of debt in New York that's coming due in the next couple of years. And it's not entirely clear who's going to write that debt or at what price. And landlords are already telling me that it's either much more difficult for them or much more expensive. And on the development side, we're seeing it with, construction lenders requiring 50% equity or more. So the banks aren't going to want to take that paper. I mean, right now, the Newmark is trying to sell that portfolio for the FDIC. And we'll see where it goes. It'll be a discount. Somebody will make money off of it, but then they're going to have to step in and actually deal with it. But in most cases, the banks don't want to foreclose because they don't want to have to take the hit to their balance sheet. So stuff goes into special servicer, sort of Neverland. And, they're not motivated to do more than the minimum. And the upkeep of, old housing in New York is, it's a full-time job and it's expensive. And again, we're going to see, buildings become decayed, then the rent roll deteriorates and it becomes a cycle, and it happens in one block and then it happens elsewhere. There's a corollary to it with the office market. They talk about nationally $1 trillion of debt that's coming due, the debt wall in the next 3 to 5 years because of remote work and other things. That has an impact on the city also, in terms of the restaurants that, have closed, the dry cleaner, the shoe shine person. If the buildings aren't full 5 days a week, that'll have a long-term impact on the city also, but it's not as immediate as what could happen to multifamily, and it's not as dramatic an impact because that's basically wiping out significant amount of wealth as opposed to people who live in houses where their elevators may not get fixed or they may not have heat. And I don't think that government is paying enough attention to that. I think the answer is that we need a rescue fund. In the 70s, in the fiscal crisis, there was a shared sense of responsibility and cooperation and concession. And ultimately, it was the city public employee unions that came in and bought city bonds and kept the city from being unable to meet payroll in a given week. What I would like to see is a combination of the public and private sectors creating a rescue fund for buildings that simply can't get refinanced, and to make sure that that just don't limp into decay, but that there's a way, whether it's through recapitalization or tenant ownership. I don't know what the mechanics of it are, but I just know that if government isn't prepared to step in, it's going to be a bigger and more costly problem down the road.
Yeah.
We're getting a lot of clients that are searching for help because operating costs are going up. They're essentially in the red. So maybe they don't have to refi for another 7 years, but eventually they're going to run out of money. That's another problem. You sort of account for this. It's sort of a perfect storm because the new rent laws that passed in 2019 created the situation where there's not enough income coming in. So you're protecting the tenants, but you're actually making life much, much harder for them, particularly if the building can't be maintained.
Look, I make my living making water run uphill. And I try to be a problem solver, but I have to tell you that I am deeply concerned because this is the worst political environment for the real estate industry in my lifetime. Whether it was the excesses and the bad actors, whether it was overreaching by the tenant advocates, the bottom line is that we're in a situation now where capital is not being invested in multifamily in the same way that it used to be. The volume of transactions is going down. There's very little upside. It's basically, if your building makes a little bit of money, you'll be happy about that. Obviously, there are some pockets with condo sales and things like that that are different. There's no tax abatement program. 421A. I was at the governor's announcement for the Gowanus workaround. It'll be important to the developers that use it, but it's a handful, and it's not clear what's going to happen in the legislative session. I'm not optimistic myself about a 421A replacement program for the next several years, because there's still a lot of work for the construction unions, and also because nobody's got the same agenda. The people who are pushing good cause eviction, basically rent protections for people who can pay what they would otherwise be calling luxury rents, have no interest in compromising. They don't care about new construction or whether it happens. The unions have their own agenda. Even within the real estate community, you have some organizations that are primarily focused on development, and then you have others that are primarily focused on rent stabilization issues. And all along the way, we've kind of lost the narrative where people think that real estate is the problem and not part of the solution.
Is a way to unify them to explain to them that if we keep going down this road, exactly what you predict is going to happen, which is these buildings are going to be dilapidated, development's going to stop, money's going to stop coming to New York, and it's going to be like what it was in the 70s and the 80s?
I'd like to think that the answer to that is yes, and it's going to take. But what the industry right now is going through the stages of grief. First, it was like denial; they couldn't really believe this was happening. Then it was anger, right? Then it was negotiations. Maybe we can work something out, and now it just seems to be acceptance. Unfortunately, the manifestation of the acceptance, I don't know about you all, is I have developer clients that are now doing work in Washington and in Miami.
Everyone's leaving the city.
Exactly.
A lot of fear.
Exactly.
Right? So, I'd like to think that at some point people will recognize what's going on. On the other hand, it's like I'm the cranky old guy. Tell those, kids to get off my lawn. And when I was a young man, we had to work 10 miles in the snow to get somebody to pay their rent check.
Uphill both ways.
Yeah, uphill both ways. So, different times call for different solutions, and it's going to take some education. Term limits doesn't help, by the way, with the city council because they don't have a frame of reference. On the other hand, I'm not sure that the lack helps in Albany, where you get people who are basically politically invulnerable and, unwilling to compromise. At the end of the day, it's going to take leadership from the governor. It's going to take leadership from the mayor. It's going to take some political muscle with the legislative leaders. And it's going to require the real estate industry to be more sophisticated, I think, in their communication strategy to be able to educate people. But at the end of the day, it's like the line from the Marx Brothers movie. Who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes, right? So as long as the advocates are out there saying that no relief is necessary, don't worry, the landlords are going to build anyway, we'll just enforce the laws. And if we have to confiscate their buildings, then, we can make them public housing because that works so well. It's not until ordinary New Yorkers start to realize what the impact is on the quality of their life. And then it's not just about homeless people. It's not just about mentally ill people, but it's about their struggles for housing, the inability of their kids to start new households in New York, the fact that their job may be on the line because costs have grown too much in the city. At some point, New Yorkers will realize that. I just hope that it happens soon enough to be able to prevent the problem from getting as bad as I think it might be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hoping that too. But it's not. It's going to take a collective effort, and it's going to take some convincing. And I'm hoping some of that will come from you because you are very convincing, and you have so much experience. And it was just spectacular talking to you. You have such a
Incredible.
Great point of view, and
It was a great meeting.
yeah. And
thank you so much for coming
there-
in.
Yeah.
I really appreciate
Yeah.
it.
Is there anything important that you think we missed? Something that you want to plug?
Yeah, just one last thought. I was an early Al Gore supporter. I supported him for president in 1988. He was right about global warming. He was right about the Iraq War. Oh, and by the way, if you do the research, you'll see that we probably wouldn't have had the internet without the legislation that he sponsored.
I'm glad you went there, by the way.
And he never said that he had invented it, just that he had sponsored it. But one thing that he said to me in the course of the campaigns, I think is perfectly applicable here too. Early to bed, early to rise, work like hell, and organize.
Love that.
That's an amazing quote.
That's
I
a
don't even
great
want to
quote.
say anything after that.
Well, everyone, that's our show. Thanks so much for listening.
And of course, don't forget to subscribe. Also, don't forget to leave comments because we love to hear from our audience, right, Brenda?
Yeah, feel free to reach out at info@sideandshine.com or visit our website at sideandshine.com. We really look forward to hearing from you.
You could also reach out to David and Brenda at dshamshovich@sideandshine.com and bslakowski at sideandshine.com.
Those are lengthy last names. You can just find us on our website.
That's right.